Perseus-Part 2 from Stories of Old Greece and Rome. Public domain reading. As Perseus hurried over the sea with Medusa's head held firmly in his hand, some of the blood dripped down into the white-capped waves and was cherished by Neptune, who had once loved Medusa when she was a beautiful maiden. From these drops of blood, the Sea King created the wonderful winged horse, Pegasus, who was to share in the adventures of another famous Greek hero, Bellerophon. Some of the Gorgon's blood had also dropped on the hot sand of Africa. As Perseus was flying upward from the Gorgon's cave, from this blood sprang a brood of poisonous reptiles that brought death to many an unwary explorer. The journey homeward was long and wearisome, and Perseus was often obliged to seek the seashore to rest. Once, as he was flying along the coast of Africa, borne aloft on the winged sandals, he saw the old Titan Atlas standing where he had stood for many centuries, with the weight of the heavens on his bent shoulders. The clouds wrapped his head so completely that Perseus could see only his immense body. Forests had grown up so high all around him that his huge legs were scarcely visible among the heavy foliage, and his broad shoulders looked like mighty boulders rising up above the treetops. But though his head was so far in the clouds, Atlas knew that Perseus was approaching. For giants have certain senses unpossessed by mortal men, and he shook the clouds from about his face and blew away the mists with his breath. Then, when the air was clear and Perseus could see the white hair that was previously hidden above the clouds, he pitied poor Atlas for his heavy punishment and stopped to speak with him. The giant looked down from his great height and begged the hero to uncover Medusa's head, which Perseus had kept wrapped in his cloak. For he was anxious to gaze upon it and become himself an image of stone. He told how weary he was of standing for all these ages without ever being able to rest, and he could not endure the thought of keeping up this torture for eternity. And so Perseus lifted up the Gorgon's head, being careful to keep his own eyes averted. And Atlas gazed long and eagerly at the dead face of the Gorgon, with its wreath of lifeless serpents. Then slowly the giant's great bulk began to harden, and the stooping shoulders became firm, unfeeling stone. As Perseus stood there watching the strange transformation, he seemed to see no longer the floating white hair of Atlas, but a pile of snow on a mountain top. And he looked no more on the huge limbs surrounded by forests, but instead he saw rents and clefts on a mountain side that just showed themselves through the thick trees. And thus was the burden of Atlas forever removed from his aching shoulders, and the heavens now rested securely on a mountain. When Perseus resumed his journey along the coast, he soon came to a place where the cliffs rose abruptly from the sea, and as he looked down at the rocks below him, he saw outlined against their dark surface a figure that made him pause in his swift flight and wonder if a sudden madness had taken hold of his fancy. For chained to the rock was a maiden so beautiful that even her constant weeping had not marred the perfect loveliness of her face. Keeping the Gorgon's head carefully concealed under his white cloak, so that the captive maiden could get no glimpse of the snaky locks, Perseus flew to the girl's side, and taking off his magic helmet, spoke to her gently. At any other time she would have been startled at his sudden appearance, but she thought of her dreadful fate, so near at hand, and this drove all other fears from her mind. The spray from the sea dashed over her, and the cold winds blew on her shivering form, but of this she seemed to be hardly aware. Her eyes were fixed in wild terror upon a cavern in the rocks, where Perseus could see a huge dragon lying stretched out on a cool, slimy seaweed. When the young hero spoke to the maiden, she did not seem to hear him, but as his gentle persistence, she at last turned her eyes away from the dreaded cavern and told him her story. She said that her name was Andromeda, and that her mother, Cassiopeia, had angered the sea nymphs by presuming to rival them in beauty. To punish the queen for her vanity, the sea nymphs sent a fierce sea monster to devastate the homes along the coast, and when the terrified people consulted an oracle to know how they might save themselves from further disaster, they were told that the monster would not depart until the Princess Andromeda was sacrificed to its fury. And so the king, her father, and her wretched, remorseful mother, and a procession of weeping attendants, had led her that very day to the rocks, and had chained her fast to await the monster's pleasure. Just as Andromeda was speaking, there was a rustling sound in the cave, as if the dragon was stretching its huge wings, and then came a sudden whir and rush as the monster glided out of the dim interior of the cave and came speeding through the water towards its victim. The scaly hide glittered in the sunlight, and the great coils of its snaky body beat up the waves as it came with incredible swiftness towards the captive maiden, whose terrified shrieks almost unnerved the young hero who had come to rescue her. Quickly he almost unnerved the young hero, who then donned his magic helmet and grasped the keen-edged sword that had already stood him in good stead. As the monster's head emerged from the waves, Perseus rushed upon it, unseen, and with a quick thrust pierced the creature in its one vital spot. The dragon sank back into the blood-stained water, and then made a few ineffective plunges towards its victims. But Perseus' blow had been sure, and the creature's great body finally disappeared beneath the waves. While Andromeda was thanking her deliverer with grateful tears, he struck off the chains that bound her to the rocks, and led her to where her parents and an astonished group of watchers had been looking on towards the strange combat. And the great joy of Andromeda's father was equaled only by the mother's happiness of her rescued child, and they both welcomed the young hero who had saved her from so terrible a fate.